It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody, where every week we seek inspiration from great men and women to become the heroes and heroines of our own lives. And you are here with your hosts. I am Andrew Bernstein. You are Robert Begley. How you doing this week, Robert?
I'm doing fabulous, Andy. Ready to talk about the man who rose up from slavery through education, entrepreneurship, and self reliance. We are talking about a gigantic hero of 19th century into the 20th century, Booker T. Washington.
Yes, probably. Man, gets dropped the probably one of the finest educators this country has ever produced.
Yes.
Tuskegee Institute was Washington built it up into
Oof.
this outstanding school. Had the wisdom to hire George Washington Carver when Carver got his master's degree, in science
Mhm.
from the school that became Iowa State University, and Carver went on it. We did Carver on the Hero Show, who went on one of the great
Yes. You and
agricultural
John.
scientists of
Yep.
history. Yeah, and
Mhm.
and Washington, of course, one of the great things that Booker T. Washington did was form a relationship with Julius Rosenwald, that Sears, one of the heads of Sears Roebuck, and other northern
Yep.
capitalists and philanthropists, and set in motion a process that resulted in thousands of schools being built in the South for young
Yeah.
black children, who the racists who ran the state legislatures and state governments in the South had no use for educating black children. So Booker T. Washington, one of the great educators in American history, and he's
Mhm.
absolutely overdue for a hero show episode.
Yeah. And Andy, one of the things I love about Booker T's story, of course, born as a slave
Yeah, we should give his
and
dates, Robert. 18,
found his freedom.
1856,
Yep.
1856 to 1915. So unfortunately, he
Right.
died. He died young. He's 59 years old. But
Yes.
he accomplished a lot of great feats in the field of
Oof.
education in that short lifetime. So you were
That's
saying
right.
about his you were saying about
He started,
his
Andy,
youth.
he started on the perceptual level as a child, uh, as a slave. And when he's 9 years old, a northern soldier comes to his home with his mom and says, "You're free." And they're like, okay, what does that mean? And now what do we do with
Right.
our freedom? And cleanliness, personal hygiene is where Washington started. The toothbrush, he called it like the most revolutionary product to help a person's view of themselves, and a comb. So this is what I mean by like kind of the perceptual level is where he started for self improvement. And then, of course, on the mind side, knowing the value of the mind. But Andy, if there's one theme here in for what Tuskegee, you just mentioned George Washington Carver, what Tuskegee and all of the education that Booker T advocated was practical. Okay, there was no ivory tower in his universe. It was knowledge for the sake of action, whether it's vocational training, whether it's becoming an educator to teach other educators. That was the thing that I found most compelling about his story is that, and so relevant today, because people who go to school, to college, any school on any level, and are not sure they're going to get a job, or they don't have a usable skill, a marketable skill. That's the opposite of what Booker T. Washington stood for. He wanted people to go out there in the world, in the business world. He loved entrepreneurship as one himself.
Yes, yeah, and we need to place this in context, Robert, because this is late
Yes.
19th, turn of the 20th century, Alabama and
Yep.
the South more broadly. Jim Crow
Yeah.
laws are in effect. Black American
Hmm.
citizens are brutally persecuted, desperately poor. There's the state. Unfortunately, the southern states are controlled by segregationists and are often brutal. Later on, George Wallace became infamous, for this as being
Hmm.
governor of Alabama. But that was the
Yeah.
mentality, and so there wasn't much interest in educating black children, in the Jim Crow South. And blacks were
No.
desperately poor. I mean, some ungodly percentage of black Americans at that point, lived in the Jim Crow South and were below the poverty line, were desperately poor. And Booker T. Washington
Right.
recognized first step is to make economic advances, rise out of poverty,
Yes.
a life of prosperity, and a prosperous, educated black class could then fight for its political rights later. But the economic rise was first, foremost, and always for Booker T.
Yeah.
Washington, and black Americans needed skills. Be farmers, carpenters, plumbers, construction workers,
Hmm.
whatever. Work honestly, productively, make a living, rise up out of poverty, be prosperous, and show the better white people in the country who are open to reason that black Americans are honest, productive, hard workers. That was Booker T. Washington's philosophy.
And Andy, this philosophy transcends race because this applies to anybody in any era. If you see the economic benefits of being honest, of being clean, of having good relations, of being talented, then you will find, you will find work. I mean, here's one of the things that I love. He says, "Learn to love labor not alone for its financial value, but for labor's own sake, for the independence and self-reliance, which." The ability to do something which the world wants done. So if you learn these skill sets, somebody in the world will want them, and you will gain economically, which is a step towards
Right,
um,
right,
what we could
you
call political rights and
right,
independence
right.
on the political scale.
Right. Washington
Hmm.
recognized that there are people who act in their rational self-interest, and that there are
Yes.
there are many. And by the way, we should point out, Robert, it's not like all white people in the Jim Crow South were racist. There were a lot who weren't. There were a lot of
Yes.
whites in the South, antebellum South,
Hmm.
who were abolitionists. There were whites in the
Right.
South, postbellum, who opposed the
Hmm.
horrible lynchings and the Jim Crow persecution.
Yeah.
And then in the North, there were plenty of white people who were racist. So we don't want to make this sound like like we're painted with this broad brush and we're condemning Southern whites as racist. Unfortunately, they were the majority, but there were a lot of whites in the South who were not. And Booker T. Washington's correct. You show people who aren't racist, people who are honest and open to reason and open to facts. You show all these
Yeah.
these honest white people in the South what you could do, and they'll hire you, and you'll
Yeah.
make money. And blacks will rise economically, which is and of course, this is an important step forward for Black Americans. The economic program of Booker T. Washington. And Tuskegee Institute, from everything I've read about it, was a superb school. I mean, he ran it brilliantly.
Yeah. He did, Andy. And again, it's really important to keep the context in mind here because if we look at that era, okay, post Civil War, Frederick Douglass was a leading spokesman, a leading abolitionist, or also who was born into slavery and escaped. So he was a generation, he was actually a couple of generations early, like 40, almost 40 years earlier than Booker T, but a huge influence on him. But I even think Booker T, this is showing the magnitude of Booker T's significance. I think he actually even had a greater impact than Frederick Douglass, which is who I like bow before, what that man did. But as far as the South, the transition to the South. So here's the context is really important because of course some were agitating for a real fast transition, and Booker T. Washington said no, it actually has to happen gradually. We can't do this overnight, but get those skill sets that you and I were talking about, Andy, and that is the best first step to go forward with as far as that goes. And on race relations, Andy, we talked about this even before the program. One of my favorite quotes from Washington, he says, a white person who treats a black person differently and poorly, it's very likely that white person will also treat other whites poorly. It's not as if he's going to make a sharp, and here's like where integrity comes in and integration of ideas, because it's not as if he's going to make a sharp distinction. He's going to be completely honest and um, personable only with white people, and then he's going to make this 180-degree change when he meets black people.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. So economic rise for Black
Yeah.
Americans. This was the agenda here, and Booker T. Washington made great contributions to that. That's one of the great things we honor him for.
Yeah.
Also, although he didn't want to get involved in politics and trying to overturn the Jim Crow laws just yet, secretly
Yes.
he supported and helped fund court cases
Yes.
against
Hmm.
the Jim Crow laws. So he was working secretly, at the political level too, although through the courts, not through overt political action and candidates, running for office
Yeah.
against. But and candidates running for office. Let's put it this way: that yes, there were a lot of honest white people in the South, but the vicious segregationists dominated. And if you try to run black candidates or white, Republican candidates who want to overthrow the Jim Crow laws, it's very possibly even likely that the Klan would kill them. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why
Sadly.
the Klan was formed.
Right.
And the Klan had a
Hmm.
lot of power. So Booker T may well have been right that economic rise first, court cases rather than overt political action and supporting candidates, against Jim Crow. So a second thing he did was to support the court cases to try and overturn Jim
Yes.
Crow. But to me, Robert, maybe the greatest, and then this is we could discuss this and debate it perhaps. To me, the greatest thing Booker
Mhm.
T. Washington did, of course, Tuskegee Institute was a tremendous school, and attracted
Yeah.
top black students from all over, especially with George Washington Carver as leading agricultural
Yes.
scientist on the staff that Washington hired and retained at
Hmm.
Tuskegee. But his relationship with Julius Rosenwald one of the heads of Sears Roebuck, and other white businessmen and philanthropists from the North, and set in
Hmm.
motion. A lot of this happened after his death, but set in motion a process where Julius Rosenwald, and Julius Rosenwald's a hero for this. We got to do an own,
Yeah.
a separate
Hmm.
hero show episode on him. But he recognized the importance of education for black children in the South. Like the state
Yes.
governments didn't care much about educating blacks. And as a process,
No.
Washington helped initiate a process, much of which occurred after his death, that where Rosenwald funded the foundation of something like 5,000 schools throughout the rural South
Amazing.
for
Hmm.
for black children. And I asked a history professor that I know, in one of the schools that was teaching it a few years ago about this, because Washington has come under a lot of fire for wanting to.
Yeah.
He was called an accommodationist for not wanting political action yet against the Jim Crow laws. And I asked the history professor
Yeah.
about this process that Washington helped initiate with Rosenwald and the 5,000 schools for
Hmm.
black children throughout the rural South. I said, did that contribute? Do you think that this contributed later on, 1950s, 1960s, to an educated black class, heroes like Martin Luther King, being able then to stand up against the Jim Crow laws because you had the basics of education. And the history professor
Hmm.
said absolutely. Booker T. Washington's
Yeah.
work with Rosenwald helped helped
Yeah.
establish an educated black middle class in the South that was able to
Hmm.
rise up in the civil rights movement. 50 years later, 40 or 50 years after his death, to
Right.
finally overturn the Jim Crow laws in those states. So Booker T's
Yeah.
commitment to education is an enormous value.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say this in closing out this opening section, Andy. As far as like personal self development, his book "Up from Slavery" is the book. Get this, it is like one of the greatest stories of a man who is able to rise up, uh, certainly from adversity, and become this stellar figure, the leader of his entire race. Okay, we'll talk more about this, but that certainly shortened his life, which we've seen in other heroes throughout history. Just the pressure that he
Yeah,
undertook. But Up from Slavery is a master work, published in 1901, and
I
we're just,
second that. I
this,
second that.
yeah,
I
hmm,
second that. I read Up from Slavery years ago. I loved it, and that thanks for
yeah,
reminding me, Rob. I'm going to reread it now. I haven't read it in years. It's a very powerful,
yeah,
inspiring
yes,
story. became a
Hmm.
bestseller in the United States and helped
Yeah.
convince President Theodore Roosevelt to invite Booker T to the White House for
Yes.
dinner, which caused an uproar amongst
It did.
white
Yep.
racists around
Hmm.
the country. And I won't even say, I won't repeat some of the things these guys said publicly. They're just vile
Yeah.
racism. But this is the kind of things that Booker T. Washington had to deal with in order to fight the
Yes.
fight that he did, and
Hmm.
ultimately win.
Hmm.
So, uh,
So let's transition, Andy. Little station
go to
break
the
here.
beginning.
You're watching. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
watching the Hero Show with Objective Standard Institute. Please like and share this program. We're doing this work. We're bringing these heroes to life and showing how they can help you in your own life. And we're celebrating Booker T. Washington. So yeah, Andy, let's start at the beginning. His life, where he's born.
1856 to 1915,
Hmm.
right? So
Yeah,
was he born in Virginia, Robert, or what
in
part of
Virginia.
the part
Yes.
that became West Virginia, that seceded from Virginia
Yeah.
during the Civil War? Virginia secedes from the Union, and West Virginia secedes from Virginia. So
Yeah. Yeah, and there was a
anyway,
difference, and so, but yeah, so his mother, her name was Jane, probably, yeah, a white slave owner, raped her. I don't know. Booker T never knew who his natural father was. But
right.
as I said earlier, it's 1856, so it's right before the Civil War. He's a slave. He's lifting 100-pound sacks, getting whipped, 6, 7 years old, and getting whipped for not doing it fast enough.
Oh,
Okay.
jeez.
And
Right.
then the war's over. Union soldier goes to their home and says, "You're free." Okay. So now what's the next step? And he sees, whenever he saw children reading, he was like, "That's what I want to do." He always saw the value of education, Andy,
And
but he was good.
those must have been white children that he saw reading back then, because they
Oh
didn't have
yes,
much
you're right.
education
Yeah,
for
blacks were.
black
Yes,
kids.
you're right. Yeah, yeah, they were banned from reading.
Right,
But
right, right,
so the family does move to West Virginia. The mother marries a man named Washington. Oh boy, what was his name? Washington Ferguson. And Booker T, when he goes to school, he travels like 500 miles, Andy, much of it on foot to get to
right.
this school. And they're like, "You don't have money." And he says, "I'll be a janitor. I'll do anything." And this is his gumption, that I am dedicated. Even if I'm 10, 11, 12 years old, I am going to get an education and do things in the meantime. It's not like I'm just going to be a bookworm and live on top of a mountain, or an ivory tower. No, for the practical sake. And so he learns, and in West Virginia, continues on. His name, he was only known as Booker. It's interesting. His middle name, Taliaferro, means iron cutter. that's the that's the Italian translation of that. It's a town, name of a town in Alabama as well. But the Washington came from his stepfather and George Washington. It was like a combination of the two. So already he's got big plans for his future here. And as I said earlier, the cleanliness part, the personal hygiene, he realizes the importance of this, and just continues on through school. I think he goes to D.C. actually for college. He goes to the Hampton Institute in Virginia initially, and then goes to D.C. for a little while. And at Hampton, which is in Virginia, he meets this General Armstrong, who becomes like his first real benefactor. He was a Northern soldier in the Civil War, and he sees the talent of Booker T. And when the day comes for him to start Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, Armstrong says Booker T is the man. So the 25-year-old at this time, Andy, he's 25 years old, and he's given in a shanty. It's like a church, and whenever it rained, someone would have to hold an umbrella so Booker T, while he's teaching, wouldn't get soaking wet. And
Wow.
the first students, I'll let you jump here in a minute. First students literally built the school brick by brick,
Yes.
the
Right.
classrooms. And it's like, here again is the practical benefits of literally building something that's going to last a long time here. Dylan, if you could show the picture of the Tuskegee classroom
Oh well,
there.
but
Yeah.
by that time, it had been built into a real school. Doesn't look
Yeah.
like you need to hold umbrellas over the professors at this point to keep the rain off there.
No.
It looks no, they built Tuskegee into a real university. And but
That's
anyhow,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yep.
yeah, we discussed already the practical, monetary benefits of having these trade skills and everything. But you just touched
Right.
on something that's also important, Robert, and that is the pride that anybody has,
Yes.
of any race, either gender, any tribe, nationality, whatever. When you make something, you're living creatively. If you're a carpenter
Yes.
and you're building something, there's that pride in your work that you take, which is also enormously valuable. We got to have the money. We got to rise up out of this desperate poverty. But you want that. You
Yep.
want to live with a pride also that
Hmm.
you're constructing. You're building. You're not destroying. You're building things up. You're not tearing them down.
Right.
You're making things. You're fixing them. You're repairing them. Well, agriculture was a big part of the economy. You're growing. You can see why some people might love farming, black or white, whatever they might love farming. You're actually growing things and growing food.
Yes.
You're not just I mean, growing flowers and vegetable life can also be very rewarding for gardening, but you're also
Hmm.
growing food, for
Hmm.
people. And so you make money selling the food, and you have the pride of knowing that yeah, hey, the work I'm doing is feeding human beings. It's
Yes.
definitely promoting human life. So there's that pride factor
Right.
too, as well as the monetary factor, and they
Hmm.
coalesce into a good life. The combination is a good life for any human being.
Exactly, Andy. And so, as the Institute is gaining stature, there are these white businessmen, including Andrew Carnegie,
Yes.
who decides what this man is doing is absolutely incredible, and I'm going to fund it. He should not need to. He thinks of Booker T. This man should not want for anything in his home, and he ends up having a nice home on the Tuskegee campus. But he's called out to all these places across the North and the South to give speeches because now he becomes an incredible orator. In fact, there's a whole section in up on slavery on public speaking, and he would get super nervous. He's like, it doesn't matter how many times I get up and speak, I'm super nervous, but I try to reach everyone in the audience, and especially because they might not see me ever again, and these white benefactors from the North and the South, you mentioned over and over again, they see the value, they see what this man is doing as a leader. There's nobody like him now because Frederick Douglass spent most of his life in the North, but I'm sorry, Booker T is in the Deep South, running this
Yes.
institute, and soon it has 100 buildings and thousands of students, and it's just exploding. And then, as you said earlier, Andy, more and more schools in West Virginia, the town where he was born. I think that's still like a West Virginia university or something. They still continue to this day. Several of the schools that he took part in their founding. So education for practical use. These were like big parts of his life. And then going on, I could say, Andy, the big presentation, September 1895, is that Atlanta exposition, which we'll talk. I definitely want to elaborate, Andy, on the criticism of him. But at first, he's invited to speak at this trade exposition, and after he finishes, listen to this one quote from um, Up from Slavery. Okay, what's this man's name? He says,
One of his benefactors, you mean?
uh,
Yeah, I
yeah,
know. Yeah, I know.
Henry
I know a
Grady. He
number.
says,
Okay.
okay, so Henry
Yeah.
Grady says that man's speech is the beginning of a moral revolution in America. Okay, page 145 in this book. A moral revolution in America. Don't we need that over and over again? I mean,
Was
that's
that was
that's
that
the
Henry Grady? Was that the Henry Grady who
yes,
was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution?
yes,
'Cause
that's right.
but
That's right.
it's interesting that because we should point out that guy was a complete, total, and utter white supremacist. I mean, literally a real white
This is what,
supremacist. Yeah,
right. This is
yeah,
what Booker T as a speaker was able to transform people on a dime. On a dime. They would just see this man. Again, Frederick Douglass, if we look at the parallels, was similarly an incredible speaker, but mostly in the North. In Douglass's time, it was too dangerous to speak in the South. And now here's Booker T in the South doing it to these white supremacists and changing their minds on the spot. And there was a lot of good that came out of that talk, and then some bad. And I do want to switch gears, Andy, because one of the most unjust things about any time you read about Booker T, there's going to be a segment of the criticism, especially from W.E.B. Du Bois, that founder of the
What,
NAACP.
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's the? I've
Mhm.
heard that. I've heard the name pronounced Du Bois, or normally I would have thought it was
Yeah,
Du
Du
Bois,
Bois.
but it's okay.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's
Yeah,
why. But anyway,
sounds French. Looks French.
yeah.
All I know
But
is
I'm
there's an
sorry,
avenue for him. There's an avenue for Du Bois or Du Bois in Manhattan, and there's not one for Booker T. That really bothers me as a as a New Yorker. And there's Booker T. Washington High School, but Du Bois was very critical, and wanted political change, wanted agitation, was a socialist, ended up renouncing even America at the end of his life, going off, I think, to like India. And so nowadays, when you read about Booker T. Washington, there's going to be a segment critical of him based on the intellectuals who think he didn't do enough in his time, and he kowtowed to the white leadership. And I think that's totally
Yeah, I think
unjust.
no. Yeah, he's known as an accommodationist, meaning that
Yeah.
he was willing to
Yep.
accommodate the brutal persecution of the Jim Crow laws, which is
Yep.
true to an extent, but you have to put it into context.
That's
Again,
right.
Washington thought the first step for Black Americans to rise was to gain skills and make money,
Yes.
be prosperous, and
Yes.
lead a good life, and show all the honest white people in the country that Black Americans were honest, hard workers. That was the first step. He didn't think that was the
Yep.
be all and end all. That was
No.
the necessary first step to focus on. And like we said, he fought the Jim Crow laws secretly in court cases, not
Yes.
in
Hmm.
overt political
Hmm.
action, and supporting various candidates, which was truly life threatening for anybody, black or white, who stood up. They have to be Republicans, because the Democrats were completely controlled by the segregationist
KKK.
mentality. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and the
Hmm.
Klan would literally murder Republican
Yeah.
candidates, black or white,
Hmm.
who opposed the lynchings and the Jim Crow laws, and everything. That was to come later. But I think if you're going to criticize Booker T. Washington, I think you have to always modify that by pointing out his commitment to education and the work with the Northern philanthropists, Carnegie, Julius Rosenwald from Sears, some of Rockefeller's
Yes.
execs at Standard
Yep.
Oil, raised the
Hmm.
money, happened to have much of it after his lifetime, some of it near the end of his life, much of it after his lifetime, to build the schools that educated black children, that enabled the civil rights movement to succeed ultimately. And I think you
Hmm.
always have to qualify any criticism you make of Booker T. Washington by pointing that out. Ultimately, I think I'm not an expert on this, but as a dilettante, I think Washington was more effective than Du Bois in promoting growth and development of Black American community. I think, yeah, and I think
Way more. Way more.
yeah, yeah,
The other thing, Andy, we haven't mentioned, but Booker T was skeptical of government action. Okay, he had seen government enforced slavery. He had seen Reconstruction as a mess. Uh, Government imposed Reconstruction as a mess, and he always felt government was not the answer. It's private initiative by individuals who want to take that action themselves. And WEB was like the opposite. He's like, no, all government all the time. That's what we
yeah,
want, and
yeah.
it's just plays out right until today. It's amazing, like the two different directions the leadership went in, and what which one is genuinely American, which one is in alignment with America's ideas of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and property. It's definitely Booker T. Washington on that
Yeah,
front.
right.
1901, yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I mean, and reach out to all the honest white Americans, to have,
Yes,
this to have this alliance to show them, hey, just because we have more pigmentation in our skin doesn't mean we're any different than you fundamentally. We're
no,
honest, hardworking, productive people who want a good life for ourselves and our children as human beings and as American citizens. And when the civil rights movement triumphs, 1950s, 1960s, you see Washington's ideal come to fruition. A lot of
that's
honest
right.
white Americans joined in the civil rights movement
Hmm.
to fight for the rights of Black American citizens.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on, 1901 is when his book Up from Slavery is published. And also he forms the National Negro Business League. Again, he knows the value of business and
Yes,
entrepreneurship, which is the way towards freedom, just as applicable today. This is why we celebrate him. And this is why he should inspire people today, because it's like, take control of your own life. That's come up from the slavery. Sadly, there's a lot of high degree of slavery happening today, in the sense of, more than 50% of your wealth just taken right off the back.
mm,
Who are you working for yourself, or for the government? And so there are some similar parallels here. Forms the Up from Slavery comes out it's a bestseller instantly. Forms the National Negro Business League. Gets both Harvard and Dartmouth give him honorary degrees from their institutes. He gets some businessmen fund a trip to Europe. He thought his entire life, it's beautiful the way he covers it in the book. He planned his entire life, I'm just going to be at Tuskegee. That's my life. That's all I want to do. And they fund this trip to Europe, and he's asked to speak in place after place. And he makes these distinctions. He says, I'll give a talk before a British crowd, and Americans will be cracking up. They'd be laughing out loud, but the British are just sitting there properly. and and even the French. He sees the French, and he's like, America. The Black Americans have a better future than the French. Like, he could see the way things were going. The direction as far as like liberty goes. So his European trip was a big success. Then comes back, and he's tirelessly working around the clock, whether it's at Tuskegee or being called across the United States to speak, to fundraise, and to meet people, to promote this cause of education, just on
right.
and on throughout the rest of his life.
Yeah, and they say this, hard work won't hurt you, or hard work won't kill you, but you have to
Yeah,
qualify that
yeah,
too. Hard work,
yeah.
if you are not stressed, stress will kill you.
Yes.
You if
The
you
anxiety of leading an entire race, of
Yeah,
having the future of an entire race on your shoulders, Andy. And one talk, Dylan, if you could show, he gives one talk, 1906, at Carnegie Hall, and he meets Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, and just here's this man. Mostly everyone is white around him, but he's got the audience gripped, and just he knows the value of the spoken word in favor of this, entrepreneurship, education, for practical use. And yeah, as you said, at 59, he was just exhausted.
yeah,
He
yeah. I
had
know,
so
I
much
know. From
stress.
what I've read about his life, he was terribly stressed. He had so much weight
Yeah.
on his shoulders, and you know, the stress and the lack of R&R. Sometimes you have to take
Yeah.
days off to be able to refuel
Yes.
to come back to the
Yeah.
battle. And
Hmm.
Washington was
Hmm.
Washington was pulled in so many different directions by so many different responsibilities that tragically he didn't take
Yeah.
care of himself, I think, to the extent he
Yeah.
needed, and dies
Hmm.
from exhaustion, in his late 50s. So it's sad. But
Yeah.
yeah, this picture from Carnegie Hall is indicative of something. You're right, Rob. He's got the audience in his grip. And then again, it points out rational human beings know that race doesn't matter. They know that what matters is character. And Booker T.
Yes.
Washington's character was as strong as could be. and well, and all these rational people, many of them white,
Hmm.
certainly respected him
Hmm.
for that, including
Yeah.
POTUS, right, President of the United States, who
Yes.
invited him to dinner. I think Washington was the first black
He had a great
dignitary.
relationship with, I'm sorry, Andy, with Grover Cleveland as well. That was the first president who actually recognized him, and he had a fabulous relationship with Cleveland. And there's some real beautiful letter exchanges between the two. And I have to say, Andy, on a personal note, the first Booker T in my life as a kid, because I never heard of Washington, it was Booker T. Jones and the MGs, the wonderful
Booker T
keyboard
and the
player, Tiny.
MGs.
And
Yeah, yeah.
then when I
Great
heard that there's
Motown.
another Booker, yeah, and
That's
of course Booker
great
T.
Motown
Jones
band.
is named the
So
Motown Band, and he's named after Booker T. Washington. So there's like a tribute there. But for me, as a kid, 6, 7 years old, I only hear about one version of this name because how many Booker T's are there? Like it's like so unique. And then you bring in the Washington side, and here's an Andrew Carnegie quote. He talks about the name Washington. Okay, the value. He says the first Washington did, for for the white race, for was the father of the country. Okay, George Washington, and now Booker T. Washington. That same last name is the father of the black race in America, and that's like, look at the stature. Look where Carnegie is putting Booker T on this level. I mean, I just think it's profound.
yeah, that's a well. Andrew Carnegie was a bookworm. He was a lifelong reader and wrote any
Yeah.
number of books. He was a very smart
Yes,
guy,
that's true.
and a
Yep.
genius. Yeah, a genius in the steel industry, without a
Hmm.
productive genius, without any doubt. I just want to make one last point about the United States here.
Yes.
Yeah, that's part of Washington and Carver's achievements, and that is there were degrees of evil. The Jim Crow laws were horrible. Thomas Sowell, the brilliant Black American economist and
Yep.
social philosopher and writer, uh, spent time in his youth, because he's in his 90s now. In his youth, the Jim Crow laws were still in effect. He spent some time in the South. I
Mm.
remember seeing him
Mhm.
interviewed. Somebody asked about that. He just said, Thomas Sowell said, it was a rotten system. Thomas Sowell said, that's a great quote. Is it talk about
Yeah.
understatement? It was a rotten
Yes.
system. Yes, yes,
Mhm.
Professor Sowell, you're absolutely right. It was a rotten system. I mean, the lynchings and everything. And in fact, it was at Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington had his staff keep. There were these lynchings of innocent, presumably innocent, because they never got to trial. So
Right.
presumed innocent until unless proven guilty,
Mhm.
because they were lynched. Um, and the newspapers covered this. It was like an event. People would come to watch the lynching like it was a picnic
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
And the law
Mhm.
enforcement did nothing. It's to stop. In some cases,
Mhm.
law enforcement officials were involved, in the Klan and the lynch mob. So you had it in
Mhm.
newspapers and magazines. At Tuskegee, Washington staff had the accounts of, I think it was over 3,600 lynchings from, I think, from the
Ah,
1880s to 1960s. Over 3,600. These are the ones that were covered by newspapers and magazines. God
mhm.
knows how many others there were. So this is evil. There's no question about this. This is evil. But there are degrees of evil. Notice uh, they didn't burn Tuskegee. The white racists didn't burn Tuskegee to the ground. They didn't murder Booker T.
No.
Washington. They didn't murder George Washington. Carver didn't drag all the students, all the Black Americans off the gulags,
Mhm.
or extermination. Well, I actually call annihilation camps, because extermination is for insects. This wasn't Soviet communism. This wasn't National Socialist Germany. This is America at its worst. This is evil without a doubt, and we have to fight it, and keep fighting against any forms of racism, including whatever's left of white supremacy in this country.
Mhm.
Uh, but even America, even at its worst, was not National Socialist Germany. It's not communist. Not communist. It did
No.
not wipe out these Booker T. Washington or George Washington Carver didn't burn Tuskegee to the ground. They didn't drag off thousands and thousands and thousands of Black Americans to concentration camps. and so it enabled, the individualism of America. It just doesn't,
Yes.
that heritage. It didn't exist in Germany. It didn't exist in Russia. It didn't exist in
No.
China, but it existed in
No.
America, in Mississippi, and Alabama, and that element of individualism restrained the racists from that wholesale slaughter that the communists and Nazis
Hmm.
engaged. When
Hmm.
uh, the communists murdered millions and millions and millions of innocent people in their unrelenting class warfare, and the Nazis did, the National Socialists did the same in their unrelenting race war. The Americans were much more
Hmm.
mitigated, that restrained by the principle of individualism that is
Yes.
powerful in the American heritage. So I just want to point that out.
Very good point, Andy. And I would say I would wrap up with Grady's point of this moral revolution is where we can now have this integration of individual based on individualism, which is certainly what Booker T. Washington advocated, because it's your life is yours. Okay, it's your responsibility, whether it's using a toothbrush or a comb, and making yourself living with dignity first, and then intellectual pursuits for practical use out there in the world. You do that, and you will find a way. You will definitely find a way for recognition, and certainly for personal fulfillment, personal development. That's, I think,
Right.
his message, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, and it fits in with an entire American theme here. Benjamin Franklin,
Yes.
Frederick Douglass,
Yes.
Booker T. Washington, they all emphasize this. Early to
Yep.
bed, early to rise makes a man
Right.
healthy, wealthy,
Hmm.
and wise. Right. That's Ben
Hmm.
Franklin from Poor Richard's Almanac, as I
Yep.
recall. Right.
That's
Hard
right.
work.
Yep.
You put in the hard work. Now, make sure you're not stressed. You gotta be able to do this in a relaxed way, where you're calm and confident, and you got to get enough R&R, enough rest and relaxation. But hard work is the ticket to rise up out of
Yes.
poverty into a successful life. Booker T. Washington showed us that in action. And I think we could
Yes.
salute him, salute Booker T. Washington here for his great achievements. Thank you for the inspirational value. Right, everybody should read or reread Up from Slavery.
Yes.
And so for everybody out there in Hero Land, I hope that we've given you some inspiration, the same inspiration we've derived from Booker T. Washington's life, so
Right.
that we can all proceed, to become the heroes of our own lives. So thanks everybody out there in Hero Land, and we'll see you next week with
See you next
more
time.
heroism on the Hero Show.